For our final show of the year, Nirmal and I got back together like we have now done for years and collected up a list of what we thought was important or trends or tools that we thought we should talk about in 2024. And then we make some predictions for 2025. This is all centered around cloud native, DevOps, containers, everything in the cloud native ecosystem. And we went for over an hour. Like we went deep into some of the pockets of stuff around infrastructure and Kubernetes fleet management, and maybe getting to this idea of recommended stacks of tools that we can all deploy together in a reasonable way without, tons of complexity. And then we talk about some fun stuff, some cool stuff that we thought was really neat and that what we think is going to happen in 2025. So this was a fun one. We do this every year, but I think this one quite possibly could be the best one. I feel like we were the most prepared. We had our thoughts actually laid out in a long list, and I hope you enjoy it. Maybe you get some of the picks out of this. Maybe you learn about some tools that you didn't know about that are going to be possibly a big deal next year. All right. See you in the new year.
Hey, Bret.
Everyone's here.
Everyone's here.
Fantastic.
Bret and Nirmal and crew just reflecting on 2024 and this crazy year that we had. An awesome year.
When we started this show, we had very little to no gray in our beards. That's how long we've been doing this. And Nirmal showed up just so that I could have a doppelganger that actually knew something that, I didn't. Like, I don't know a lot, and I was running out of my own knowledge. And he keeps waiting for the paychecks, but spoiler, they're not stuck at the post office.
Checks in the mail, right, Bret? At the end of the year, we hang out and reflect on all the cool things that we saw this year. And then, if we have time, we'll go into what we think is coming up in 2025, right?
Like, honestly, there was no new surprise, I feel like, this year. We had all the things I feel like we were talking about this year in general, we were talking about last year. They're just better this year. So I don't feel like, 2022, obviously the year of GPT becoming public knowledge, that was a big deal. And we've had other sort of massive shifts. And this year was just like more of the same. So it's kind of a cool year to reflect and go, okay, where we are now and where do we see the tea leaves in this going? So we're going to do that. We actually have, thanks to Nirmal, a really impressive list that it will be impressive if we get through it all.
We're going to try it. So we got 3 main sections we're going to cover today in our Best of DevOps 2024 show. We're going to cover themes and trends that we saw this past year. We're going to cover the topic that I know Bret loves, tools and projects that we liked in 2024. And then the last bit of time, we're going to get into some projections and predictions for 2025. All right, 2024, big year for Kubernetes and the CNCF. Well, we were at KubeCon, and definitely the main theme is that Kubernetes and the CNCF community is transitioning into the next phase of maturity. It's no longer this up-and-coming project. It's 10 years old, right? Kubernetes turned 10 years old this year. We had a bunch of those KCD birthdays. CNCF now is 200 plus projects, 17 million contributions this year.
Oh, wow.
Which is like astonishing. 250 made by 255,000 contributors across 193 countries. We could probably spend a decade going through every single CNCF project of today. It would take us a decade to go through them all.
And we're like at almost 300 episodes in this podcast,
right,
if you want to call it that. And they're about to outpace us in terms of we are releasing an episode a week for 6+ years now. And they, I think they're actually releasing more than one project, like more than one. In fact, we're going to get into it. One of my things I want to talk about is Sandbox and reading the tea leaves and seeing what's coming out there. But I'm just showing on screen for those of you listening, the 30, I think it's now 29 or 30 graduated projects. What is a graduated project? Let's just remember real quick that it's an open source project, step one. It has to be open source, and it has to be something that has more than one vendor behind it. So it needs a whole bunch of community involvement. It has to get, I think in that process from incubation to graduation, they have to go through a security audit. a lot of times they have to refactor before they can even get to graduated because there's a lot of assumptions they made when they were a young project that now that when they're mainstream and a lot of companies are using them, I heard a story actually at KubeCon about like tips of young projects getting into the sandbox is don't delay a lot of your refactoring because once you get big and you're on your way to graduation, that's going to be much harder. So if you're choosing tech debt, like if you're choosing to push off the tech debt, don't because that will only be harder later. But these are projects that I would argue probably thousands of companies are using in production to get to graduated. And we now have 30 of them. And I'm not saying you could make a full-fledged tech stack, which we will also talk more about today, but I'm not saying you could build your entire tech stack on top of just the 30 graduated, but we're a heck of a lot closer to that than we were 5 years ago. Like I feel like we've got some heavy hitters in here between networking and storage and deployment automation and cert management and runtime security stuff and observability. Like there's a ton of observability stuff around here. I'd say probably half of them are security and observability related.
Observability, yeah. So that's the next theme. So the first one for sure, and I think we kind of saw this at KubeCon in Salt Lake City and a little bit even in Paris, is that Kubernetes is enterprise mature now. It is the main thing, right?
Yeah.
Leading edge enterprise and tech companies use Kubernetes for all types of workloads, including the big ones this year and last year, AI, training, and inference. Of course, that was a major theme, which I'm not going to focus too much on because I think it takes a lot of the focus right now in the community and everyone talks about it. But
yeah,
the major models are trained on Kubernetes, presentations at KubeCon around that. Inference is happening, and all the other kinds of workloads are happening on Kubernetes. And then those graduated projects, the maturity of the internal developer platforms, kind of what you were talking about there, Bret. Like we're like a hop, beat, and a skip away from having that tech stack. And I know we'll get into that a little bit later in the show today about 2025 and thinking about it as like the tech stacks of the olden days, if you will,
right,
and how that applies to Kubernetes now and CNCF. But the other theme this year is IDPs. They're here. People are building them. They're getting more mature. There's a focus on simplification, on having opinions about those 200 projects in the CNCF and picking the ones that enable you and your use cases that you have. And then another thing, theme and trend is observability and security, right? So open telemetry, lots of activity, and again, another acceleration. Last year was a really big year for open telemetry. 2024 was no different. We're seeing more and more of the projects and tooling kind of standardize on open telemetry, integrate with open telemetry, and the observability space maturing. So that's one area. And then the security tooling around like Karpenter, OPA. So these are the major themes with respect to IDPs, Kubernetes maturing, and the two main operational points of view, observability, security, really kind of settling in terms of maturity and then venturing into deeper troubleshooting, deeper use cases, and integrating GenAI into the operations of your platforms. So what are some other themes and trends that you saw this year, Bret?
Yeah, what I feel like is starting to happen, well, this has been happening, but I feel like we are continuing to see what I would call legacy pre-CNCF apps, or things that were around before the CNCF, or things that were outside the CNCF while they grew up, open source projects. It feels like they're all trying to be a part of the CNCF. And at first, if I had to characterize the first 5 years of CNCF, it was a wondrous time of what can we create here? This is an amazing idea. As soon as I heard the announcement about the CNCF, I didn't actually know any of the staff. But back then, 2014, 2015, I was very excited about the idea of let's bring all these projects together under one management, funding, oversight, governance, all that sort of stuff. Let's organize this. And what better way than the Linux Foundation? I mean, there's other foundations out there, right? There's Apache Foundation, stuff like that. But it felt right. And I didn't know what it meant, but I was very excited about the idea that it wasn't going to be a single vendor or a few big giant vendors that controlled everything. And no one knew about it, right? Like for years I've been saying, hey, do you know about the CNCF? And like my friends, my sysadmin friends, they're like, none of them have ever heard of this thing. They don't know anything about it. They think cloud native is sort of a term for when you run something in the cloud, right?
Right.
And these are devs and sysadmins that are sort of what I would say normal. They're not drinking the Kool-Aid like you and I are. And they're not in the middle of this stuff. And so I felt like we were still on the outside saying that containers are the future. It's the reason I changed my whole career a decade ago was I felt like containers were absolutely the next decade of tech evolution was going to be centered around containers. Luckily, I was very right. This bet paid off. And, you're managing container stuff you're part of the oversight of container stuff at the largest cloud in the world. And I feel like you just announced stuff at reInvent. Like things are going well for containers. Like I feel like we've won. So to lean into that idea that like the industry, I think, is figuring out that this is winning. Like this model of we take projects, we put them into a landscape, we give them a maturity model that everybody starts to understand. They have to play well with others because you can't really do that long-term safely in open source unless you do play well with others. Yeah. And everyone else, as we will see later, as we start to poke into some things, like some old school technologies trying to like say, hey, look, I can be CNCF too. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's affecting the way that these other projects look at themselves in the ecosystem and how they want to integrate with others. It's just far reaching. And it's to the point now where I feel like CNCF is everywhere. And if you still don't know about it, it's probably because you live in a very little, not to say that it's wrong, but like you live in a little niche, and that's okay. Let's say you're a Rubyist and you only go to a Ruby conference and you only really do everything in Ruby and you're lucky. You don't have to be a polyglot. You don't have to manage infrastructure as well as code.
Right.
Like you could just live in your little bubble, and that's amazing. I know Java people like that. I know .NET people like that. But eventually when you start moving away, you have to start getting involved with infrastructure, or you have to start implementing your stuff to the cloud. Like a major cloud, not a little boutique cloud that operates on your one way of deploying things, which there are those out there and they're great. But when you start to open up the veil of everything in tech, it's hard to ignore the CNCF now. Like it really is sort of everywhere. And I'm very excited about that because it feels like you and I were there to help make a difference. Like we were there to help change and make things better. Whereas before I was always a passenger. I always felt like I was just on the outside watching things in tech happen around me.
I'm going to take a little bit different take on that. I think we're in our bubble though, Bret. Sometimes,
of course, yes,
of course,
we always are in a bubble.
We like breathe in and drink this stuff all the time, as you kind of mentioned. But my day to day talking to customers and people outside of our bubble, I think there's a large group of folks in the IT industry that are waiting for a certain level of maturity with respect to the tools and processes and technologies we're talking about, that we're waiting for a certain level of maturity, standardization, stability, scale before jumping on, right? Maybe it's because of risk profiles. Maybe it's because of their own industry, yearly, multi-year kind of cycles that they're in for maybe responding to new compelling events this past year. I think what you're seeing is that the CNCF, Kubernetes, building platforms has reached that maturity for the late adopters, the
laggards. I'm just going to call them laggards.
I'm not going to call them
people
laggards.
That wait for everyone else to do it first.
Right. And so today we wouldn't talk about, hey, there's this new thing called Linux. Like you should run your applications on Linux and you should use Linux as their first choice operating system. Like that's kind of baked in now into most conversations, right? Not all, but most. Kubernetes is one step. It's achieved one step more on the maturity where it will be assumed in the future, right? Like there'll be a point where we don't really talk about Linux in all the details. Well, we do now because of all these other layers, but in the sense of we'll be talking about the stuff that's built on top of Kubernetes more than we will talk about the like tweaking the API server and the control plane and how to write controllers in a specific way. And we've achieved this one step along that path. And that unlocks, because of the simplification that 10 years of working on all these tools, maturing the IDPs and the patterns and the reference architectures. New folks to the community, new adopters now are taking advantage of the simplicity that we've seen and grow in 2024. I think 2024 CNCF projects, Kubernetes, building IDPs is the simplest it's ever been in this community. And it will only continue to become, one can hope it will only become simpler into the future as people start to build on top of it. And fulfilling that promise of becoming the data center operating system or the cloud operating system, if you will, into the future. A little bit different take. I think sometimes we're in our bubble, but that doesn't mean that we're not right.
Well, to be clear, I would never suggest that there are very few people that, in my opinion, live outside the bubble. And those are usually analysts, right? Because they're not allowed to live in a bubble if they're good. I think the rest of us, it's all about our shared experience, right? Like what and me are like, if I had not started this little tech startup 15 years ago, that we forced ourselves to use Docker and I had to learn it early days, I probably wouldn't have heard about Docker until 2020 or later. Like I probably would not have ever convinced myself that this was the next move of the entire industry and that it was like basically the next wave of innovation. And I wouldn't have done it. And a lot of my friends that I used to work with, right before, like up until 2009, when I sort of left corporate America, they were all Microsoft systems engineers. We were running a Microsoft data center. We weren't anti-Linux. We just weren't Linux experts, so we avoided it. And I would play with Linux at home, which I had been doing, since the 90s, and FreeBSD, which I have this random little thing. I just saw someone who's going to speak at a CIVO conference next year from the FreeBSD Foundation, and I was like, that's awesome. Like, I love to see that these things that BSD and FreeBSD are still around, because I haven't played with them in 15 plus years. But these people still are doing amazing work. They're just not drinking this Kool-Aid yet. And I think it's largely because, one, those things still work. Microsoft still sells all that software. And this hasn't become so much easier and better that they're ignoring it, right? This hasn't become so plug and play and universally, especially when you have a Windows environment, that it's universal. So I definitely believe you're right. Like we all live in our bubbles. However, I have to define CNCF a lot less nowadays to people I know and whatnot.
Very true.
So I feel like we're getting there. And the graduated projects help. I feel like when it was just Kubernetes, Containerd, and a couple of other ones, I mean, we just got Cert Manager graduated at KubeCon, right? Like the thing that we were already all using to manage certifications, which is one of the fundamental security layers of everything.
Certificates, right?
Certificates. Did I say certifications? Certificates. Yes. PKI is a fundamental part of even installing Kubernetes. And the fact that that is just now graduated means that we've still got a pretty good amount of pace probably of before we can say, this whole stack is fully mature. We can predict that they're going to be at least around another 5 years or more, that the projects are healthy, they're well governed, they have security, regular security audits, they've got ample documentation, customers, end user stories. But I feel like the CNCF has done a really good job of that, because that's another, to me, user in stories are important. Showing how people have had success on these is really important. And luckily, we're seeing a lot of that lately.
Yeah. Well, let's get into, I know you love to talk about tools and your favorite projects. Bret, what are some of your favorite tools from 2024?
Well, you made a pretty good list of actual CNCF projects. So I took a little bit of a different stance where I'm a big fan of Argo. It's continuing to mature. There's more and more stories come out about Argo CD. Now it feels like that people that were using Argo CD are now just sort of adopting the rest of the Argo events, Argo workloads.
Portfolio,
the rest of the Argo portfolio, which is not a bad plan. I mean, they're obviously going to be more tightly integrated. You and I talked at KubeCon about how that feels like it's now a part of the default stack. I'm still a big fan there. And honestly, if I could replicate myself, I'd be making Argo CD courses and selling them. I got to find the time to do that, because I really believe that, and Flux, there's nothing wrong with Flux. It's fine. It's just a matter of, let's get everybody closer together on how we deploy and update and recover from software. Like the deployment pipeline, we've had no standards in the industry. And I feel like we've had very little to none, other than just concepts of like, this is Canary, this is red-blue, or like we have blue-green rather. Blue-green. I'm looking at my Christmas
red-green. It's a holiday season.
Red sounds bad. Anytime there's a color of my of my deployments that is red, it feels bad. But we've had these concepts, but no consistent way of implementation, as I think is my big beef. And every shop I walk into has what I feel like is a completely different set of deployment.
Yeah, but the conversations at KubeCon and with the folks that I talk to, Argo. It's just Argo right. all the time. Right. And so you're right. Like if you're out there and you're starting to explore diving deep into the different projects and what to focus on, Argo should be in your top 5 of the projects that you should learn. It's not quite the default, but pretty much, right? It's where the community is focusing a lot of effort on.
It's got enough knobs to dial on it, like little things we can tinker with and settings we can change, that I feel like it's going to meet the 80-20 rule of like 80% of the workloads can fit into the Argo deployment pipelines. And then whether you choose to be Git focused or image update focused in your registry, like it supports both those options. It has the app of app patterns and the application set patterns, which are patterns that allows me to define how I expect apps to be deployed in one repo for my organization. And then all the other devs can make their apps the way they want, and it just sucks them up and deploys them automatically without them having to do hardly any YAML, which is awesome. But the one wish I had for Argo is that it wasn't only Kubernetes, because I feel like in the world of CI/CD, and if you and I remember, we were at DockerCon like 2018 or 2019, and we were talking about CI/CD being the next space of innovation and where we needed to standardize. We saw all these startups happening in that space. We felt like this is where the energy is going now that we've solved or defined the runtime at least and defined what orchestration is of workloads. Let's to focus on the deployment or the delivery of that. And the only thing I wish is that Argo worked in more ways outside of Kubernetes, or any way outside of Kubernetes. Wish it could work with Compose and just Docker alone on a few servers, or Swarm, or ECS, or with just cloud APIs that might just run your workloads in different ways. You don't even know if it's Kubernetes underneath. Just because it's got a great web portal, it's got a great workflow, it's flexible. I just wish it was beyond Kubernetes, because it's kind of like a lot of these tools we're going to talk about. They work on Kubernetes or not. I mean, you don't use them if you don't want to use Kubernetes. And it feels like all this great innovation is forcing us to use Kubernetes. And I'm not anti-Kubernetes by any means. My income depends on Kubernetes. But I do wish that for those outliers, for those people that are maybe going to do something temporarily in addition to Kubernetes or outside Kubernetes, that they could also have a single way of deployment for all of their different types of workloads. And Argo right now, as far as I know, absolutely 100% depends on the Kubernetes API before it will function. And it's a shame. I wish it was more. Anyway.
So we'll see. We'll see if
that's a prediction, because I don't think they're going to do it. But all right, one other tool. I know we're going to run out of time. Okay. GitHub announced Copilot is free for limited certain uses. And we have talked a lot about AI dev tools on this show. I have been using GitHub Copilot in Vim now this year. I've actually adopted it in Vim. It's not near as fancy as what you get out of the box with it in VS Code, but I have tab completion of every line that I put into a Vim, into NeoVim. Anyway, there was experiments this year, and I was trying to adopt other tools. We had continue.dev on the show, which allowed you to change your model, which now GitHub is responding to the competition in the industry. And they continue.dev and others were experimenting with letting you use lots of different models. Now GitHub does that, or Copilot specifically does that in VS Code. When I talk about this, I'm really talking about the Copilot plus VS Code, because I have not used GitHub Copilot in like JetBrains or other editors beyond NeoVim. The fact that they're giving away free now, which is similar to what the Cursor fork, I guess, of VS Code was offering. They had a little bit of free stuff there. And VS Code, as well as Copilot, have integrated a lot of what Cursor was doing. I'm not spelling doom for these other ones, but it's one of those things where most of us don't want to change our editor in order to get AI features. Like we all have our editors for various reasons, but we tend to kind of be set a little bit in our ways as devs when we find our best tooling workflows. And so an AI code editor that I have to change to a different editor to use kind of felt weird. It felt like, why can't I just use this in all the tools I have?
Yeah, and this goes back to the conversation we had with Victor and on the DevOps Paradox podcast earlier this year, where we talked about AI and how success of AI integrated into a product has to be integrated as a feature. It can't be the product itself. It can be, but that's not going to be the most. We're not seeing that's where the success is, and that just reinforces that same thing where it's a feature integrated into existing tools or a feature enhancing a feature of an open source project or someone's product. And so we're just seeing that trend play out essentially in real time here.
Yeah.
Excited to see where all these tools go into 2025. And I think there'll be a lot more of this shakeout as people continue to explore use cases and finding value in these Gen AI tools. But before we get there, do you mind if I go through my list real quick?
No, not at all. What's your list?
So the first one, this is starting to show up more and more. I think 2024, because we're in our bubble, Bret, there's a large part of the IT industry where they're still running their workloads on premise in their own data centers, typically on VMware virtual machines. And more folks want to get all the goodness from the Kubernetes control plane, from the Kubernetes CNCF community, but they don't know how to convert their workload from a virtual machine into a container necessarily, or maybe that will take some time. I know we've talked about containerizing applications for a decade plus now, me and you. That's not always possible. And so KubeVirt.io is a CNCF project that enables essentially virtual machines to be workloads that are managed by the Kubernetes control plane. I've seen an increase in activity around this project. It's showing up in customer conversations I'm having where folks are looking to, like I just mentioned, get the goodness of the CNCF and the Kubernetes community and just have their VMs, and they can't containerize them just yet for whatever reason. And so KubeVirt enables that, and it also enables some really cool use cases. So this hybrid, and this is one of the kind of things for 2025, but the hybrid use case and workloads is definitely something that I see increasing. And that's in line with the fact that Kubernetes is maturing, and we are, like, as we just mentioned, this late adopters, this silent majority, if you will, this late adopters, they're running their stuff on VMware virtual machines most of the time, and they're trying to get to the cloud and they want to go the Kubernetes route. And so keep an eye on KubeVirt. I think it's an awesome project of 2024. It continues to mature.
I have questions for you real quick. You may not get to this whole list, but real quick, what's an anecdote for KubeVirt? Because I have no customers using it. No one I've worked with is using it. Are these people that are adopting Kubernetes for containers, but they're such fans of Kubernetes, they're tired of sort of waiting for all their legacy workloads to become containerized, so they're just like, let's go all in on this? Are they trying to leave VMware and this is like their open source alternative to VMware? Like, what's maybe a customer archetype that is using this heavily?
Yeah, the simplest way I can describe it is, or the simplest kind of use case is, when we talk about containerizing your applications or migrating to the cloud for typical complex production applications that are running in a virtual environment on premise, you can't just like snap your fingers and go, okay, now I'm in the cloud and now I'm containerized and now I'm using Kubernetes. It takes some time to transition those applications to migrate them potentially, and also to modernize them. That takes some time. But during that time, our customers want to take advantage of Kubernetes, standardizing on Kubernetes, wanting to have all their workloads controlled and like the life cycle of them controlled by for example, EKS. And so KubeVirt helps bridge that, where it allows you to have virtualized workloads, virtual machines show up on your Kubernetes control plane as like a Kubernetes controlled resource essentially. And so you can deploy applications to virtual machines instead of just containers. And it allows you to bridge that time where you're migrating and you're also modernizing your applications. Because as much as we want to wish it's, like day zero, You have this legacy Java application on a VM in an on-premise, some rack of on-premise hardware. And day one, you're like in the cloud on an EC2, or it's a pod on some Kubernetes cluster. That's just not realistic and not the real way people like move their mission critical production workloads. So KubeVirt is definitely a great tool there. And it's something that we're seeing, like the use case of migration, modernization, and then also, that hardware that you have on premise that has its own life cycle, right? So you might be in a 5-year, you've already bought or purchased that on-premise hardware, but you want to take advantage of like the things like Argo, right? You just mentioned Argo doesn't really work outside of Kubernetes. Well, I want to use Argo, but I want to use it with my virtual machines and not have to think about something separate. KubeVirt can bridge that. And also, just a quick plug, at reInvent, EKS released hybrid nodes, which is another way of connecting more. It's not like the same thing as KubeVirt, but it allows you to use on-premise virtual machines and connect them to EKS clusters as usable compute. There's a lot of exploration in that space today, and I think that's going to be a trend for 2025. And it'd be great for the December 2025 show to see how far things like KubeVirt, hybrid nodes have gone, because that's the group, the audience that is new to the CNCF, as we just mentioned, right? Our sysadmin friends that are managing large amounts of VMware VMs on ESX and all that jazz. That's the more common majority day to day, as much as we are in our CNCF bubble. So that's the first project. And this is not in order of priority, but just wanted to call out KubeVirt because it's not like the same thing that we keep seeing, Gen AI and like these advanced use cases, but CNCF maturing and Kubernetes maturing to start to tackle the workloads. That's where some exciting stuff has happened in 2024. The next one is KEDA, right? So that's the Kubernetes event-driven architecture tool, KEDA.sh. Event-driven autoscaling, sorry. But it helps with event-driven architectures, running them on Kubernetes. This is a pretty interesting CNCF project. It allows you to build out event-driven architectures on Kubernetes. So what does that mean? Event-driven means that you aren't spinning up the compute or the process or container until there's some kind of event. So you have to have some kind of trigger, right? Some kind of like message bus, harkens back to one of those ESB type architectures in the past, right? So distributed application architecture, you have part of that's event-driven. And then that KEDA looks at those events that are coming on some kind of message queue and then automatically does horizontal pod autoscaling to respond to those messages. And we're seeing a lot of interest in 2024 around this project because of AI inference workloads, right? Inference jobs, like if we're interacting with Copilot or some kind of LLM model, maybe it's chat-based, or that's typically some kind of request you're making. And to most efficiently use the compute, this GPU heavy compute to do that inference job, you might want to use something like KEDA to kind of scale that out and respond to inference jobs or other events, and then also scale down, right? So when there's not as many events coming through, you don't have pods just sitting there waiting for it. Take a look at KEDA. It can drive a lot of advanced use cases, and especially for event-driven architectures. I'm like just rocking and rolling. Let's keep going. Cloud native reference architectures. This was a big announcement at KubeCon. I think we touched upon it a little bit in our KubeCon show, but I want to call that out, that there's a reference architecture working group or community within the CNCF. You can go to it. You can see there's 2 reference architectures right now, I believe. Anyways, there's a cloud native reference architecture end user technical advisory board that has some awesome community members. There's 2 reference architectures. We'll find the link. But this is exciting. I think, again, in the theme of maturity of the CNCF and Kubernetes, it's great to see an end user driven community within CNCF publishing vetted, production ready reference architectures for all of us to make better sense of this massive landscape, have some opinions, and learn from each other the best practices to use all the goodness that comes from the CNCF and these communities in your environments for your production workloads. There's one from Adobe and there's one from Allianz. There's two reference architectures. Adobe has been working in the space showcasing especially their Ethos platform, which is shameless plug. I had John Weber from Adobe as a co-speaker at reInvent talking about the Ethos platform and these reference architectures, and also the Canoe project, which is another stab at these reference architectures. So another open community creating reference architectures. I just think this is awesome. I think this is really beneficial to people that are coming to the CNCF community that are new. They're trying to figure it out, trying to navigate how to best use all these things. I'm excited to see where this reference architecture group goes and see more of them. So check those out, and also Canoe. I think this is going to be crucial for helping enable the next group of sysadmins, platform engineers, SREs, developers take advantage of Kubernetes. And then the last one, when we were doing our KubeCon show, Bret, at the same time, there was a workshop going on at KubeCon, and the workshop was around Karpenter. And it was a 500 plus person workshop. It's probably one of the best attended workshops at KubeCon, jointly presented by AWS and Microsoft around Karpenter. And I know we've talked about Karpenter on the show over the years. It's a CNCF project now. It's a different way of doing autoscaling for the nodes and the data plane of your Kubernetes platforms, your Kubernetes environment and clusters. Check it out. It's really awesome. And there's a lot of excitement around it. So that was a lot of things to check out, but definitely the top ones that I can think of in 2024. I'm sure others will have other opinions. There's plenty to choose from, but kind of wanted to show the breadth of the different areas that have been just accelerating this past year.
Yeah, I remember. So when we're talking about a little bit about stacks, this is by the way, for those watching, this is an image from that workshop.
Yeah, it was nuts.
Very packed room, seats filled. Yeah, 2025, like the year of Kubernetes stack, and actually talking about projects together rather than projects separate. I did a little short from KubeCon talking about tech stacks. I mentioned Canoe. Didn't know actually about the architecture announcement for that, but the need for us to have interoperability between these and opinions on how you use them together to create a human workflow for getting things done. It's still super nebulous for people. Like everybody's learning tools, but not learning how they all work together. You end up like, what do I need this one for? And then you have to define, well, this is the problem you need this to fix. Because when you adopt one tool, it creates a problem that you need this tool to fix. There's a whole lot of, I take it for granted. We've been doing this a while. I've been doing this 30 years now. As of next year, it'll be officially 30 years of me getting paid to do IT. And man, I'm old. But there's a whole lot of understanding of like the things that have gone wrong. And this is why I need Falco. And this is why I need Cert Manager. And this is why I need this particular automation tool for deployments or this particular, and when you're young, you haven't experienced the problems that make these tools necessary. In fact, containers and DevOps in general are all ideas that came out of this sucked before. This is why we have to do it like this now. And so a common problem I see for people coming in out of university, freshers, like people that are just on their first job or they're still in school and they're still learning this stuff, is they look at all this stuff as unnecessary complexity. And they're like, well, I can just get a server, SFTP my files over and run my app. What is all of this crap for? And it's a legitimate question when you don't understand all the problems of making an enterprise of software of thousands of different apps all running together for an organization. We don't teach people the problems first so that they understand why these solutions exist. It's a little weird sometimes because you realize trying to explain Docker to someone now when they don't think that it's in any way necessary or beneficial to anyone, it makes you realize, oh, they haven't had the problems that the entire industry realized were problems now.
And I think there's still problems today. Like people are still experiencing those issues today. But yeah, so let's go right in. You were kind of starting to go into our predictions of 2025, right? Projections and predictions. So one is, like you mentioned, this idea of like a LAMP stack for Kubernetes, the reference architecture community, the Canoe project, open community. I think are stabs at this. They're taking aim at creating that LAMP stack, if you all remember, right? Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, like thing for Kubernetes. I definitely think that's for sure like gonna mature, and there's gonna be more of them. We're going to see more de facto default options and the other projects starting to integrate. If the project today doesn't have something that integrates with Backstage or has awareness of Argo, I think we're going to see more of that interoperability, as you said, going into 2025. Out of that, too, is potentially architectures that support specific workloads and use cases. So I know we can't do a show about 2025 without mentioning AI. What's your thoughts on AI next year?
I feel like it's the year, it could be the year, now that we've seen, it feels like the KubeCon community has started to focus on making it easier to manage AI workloads on Kubernetes. So I think we talked about this in our KubeCon show, that we've kind of moved on from, it does work. You can run AI workloads in containers. You can run them on Kubernetes. There are edge case problems that are unique to GPUs and limited hardware resources. Like in the history of containers, we've never really had to deal with, well, what happens when I run out of CPUs or capacity and there is no more provisioning? I can't provision it. It doesn't exist. This does happen to people. Obviously, we're all limited in funds, but like we're broke, so we have to deliberately use old stuff. And I'm talking about GPUs, right? This is the new hardware that we've never, in the history of containers, this is the first time we've actually added to the industry a new type of hardware that we really was very, very, very edge case, very special, totally not built in all the tools. Now I feel like it's going to be an assumption. It's going to be built in all the tools. We're going to get a lot more control. I mean, think about the idea, like I don't even know how, and I'm not even smart enough to know if this is even happening yet, but we have all this C group stuff built into the kernel for all these other resources. When will we have that same level of C group and namespace scoping? When are we going to have that for GPUs, right? So that GPUs are without special hardware drivers. Granted, NVIDIA has a bunch of stuff and it's supposedly great. People tell me it's great. But when are we going to see more than just NVIDIA GPUs and not proprietary,
So I think 2025 will be the year of more hardware options, but I don't think in 2025, I don't think we're going to get out of having to, and we talked about this at KubeCon for sure, pre-AI, pre-GPU container abstraction level, we would rarely talk about, like this processor versus this processor, right? We would talk maybe about the x86 versus ARM architecture and that kind of thing, maybe the operating system and the CPU architecture. But now with these type of advanced workloads and the performance needs for direct access to the hardware and really intimate access of the hardware, 2025, we're not going to get out of things like Nickel and like in the AWS world, having EFA drivers inside your container so that you can take advantage of connecting your container directly to GPU, GPU to GPU memory connections, interconnects. Like we're not going to get out of there. Like that, the performance demands of these workloads, the performance cost value proposition relies on squeezing the most amount of high bandwidth performance out of this hardware. And so 2025, we're still going to be deeper with the hardware than we've done in previous years. I think there's going to be more varied hardware options, and I'm excited to see how people take advantage of things beyond just NVIDIA GPUs. But the interconnects between different nodes in your compute matter now if you're doing those type of workloads. So in 2025, there's going to be more advancements with respect to drivers, the container maturity, versioning, and the performance and the operation manageability, cycle management of that stuff and those workloads. But we're not going to get out of having to know about, if you're an SRE watching this and you're about to venture into tackling machine learning and AI workloads, you're not going to get away from having to know NVIDIA drivers, for example, potentially. This is not going to happen.
Right. And because these things are so expensive to operate, and so like the acquisition is one part, but operating is another part. And then we're looking at all these other options beyond GPUs or beyond NVIDIA, like the industries, like any news about anything related to this stuff, this hardware shows up at the top of my feeds everywhere, even though I'm not looking at AI specific stuff. It's just sort of news because we're spending billions and billions of dollars on this stuff. It feels like we're also paying more attention to energy usage, which leans into the environmental impact of Kubernetes and all these things. So I wouldn't be surprised if we've seen this over the last couple of years, especially at KubeCon, where people are showing off how they're able to sort of quantify impact, not just energy usage and not just cost, but also environmental impact of their apps. And this all has felt sort of, it's very early days, so it feels kind of hacky, and there's a lot of assumptions that you have to build in. And I wouldn't be surprised if that starts to become more standard. Like, in other words, you're going to see these kind of things bleed into our monitoring and observability tools just as an out-of-the-box thing. And you plug in some values, and hopefully you get something that's at least semi-accurate, or at least allows you to compare and contrast what you're doing in certain places. And you're like, oh, wow, this one app that we don't really care about that much anymore, suddenly we realize it's in the top 10% of our CPU or energy usage. Like, we didn't have that kind of stuff before. And most companies, at least that let's just say, I've never worked for or in a company where that was a priority. It was just a cost center. It was just like, this is what it costs to do that app. If you love the app, you're going to have to pay for it. And it was never about comparing or understanding or saying, well, what if we did this? Now suddenly we lowered our energy usage by 10% because we changed this one feature. That I've just never, it's so rare that I just feel like it's going to be more prominent now, because the entire cloud has been getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and hardware is getting cheaper. But all of a sudden now we have this giant explosion of cost in the physical infrastructure that, anyway, it's got to happen.
Yeah, for sure. FinOps, and we haven't really actually talked much about that on our show. So maybe that's a topic for 2025, but FinOps for sure. But basically what you're talking about, right?
People this is us basically making our 2025 guests.
Right,
timeline.
Yeah. But outside of that, two quick areas for sure. The cluster being cluster as a service, fleet management, multi-cluster management, treating clusters like cattle versus pets, if you want to use that analogy. The cluster being the unit that gets managed. We saw that we started seeing that early on in 2023. 2024, it was like the main thing. And I've typically seen in more advanced customers, but the fleet management, multi-cluster management, as it gets integrated into different CNCF projects, awareness of multiple clusters and scaling to multiple clusters, I think is like the next level of maturity, and we're going to continue to see that. I think that's going to be one of the prominent operational modes for 2025.
Yeah. Managing Kubernetes with Kubernetes.
Yes.
From a separate cluster. I mean, we've talked about this before, but like...
Great transition to the next thing.
Like, this is a very specific trend that was only done by the biggest companies before, but now it feels like we're getting maybe close to where you maybe need to start thinking of it as the default approach.
Potentially, yeah.
I don't know any clouds that do this out of the box, by the way. I don't see anybody representing this as like, when you install Linux now, for a long time, really, there's an option when you're first installing it from hard mode, ISO, and you choose, am I server or GUI? Am I desktop or server? It's the same thing, but it chooses the different packages and the dependencies and stuff when you're making that choice. And I feel like if it's not 2025, it's hopefully short thereafter, that the tooling that we use for deploying Kubernetes, a cluster, gets to that choice. To the point where I'm like, is this your cluster of clusters? Or is this a cluster from that cluster? Are you just doing one cluster, one off? Or is this going to be the cluster that deploys and manages all the other clusters? I know Rancher already does that out of the box from their consulting side. I don't know if their GUI actually leads you down that path, but when they consult with companies now, they want to build a main cluster first that is its purpose to deploy and manage other clusters. And companies that I've worked with actually have an aversion to that because they're like, well, we're not that big because we only need a couple.
But I think the convergence of more mature reference architectures and like that stack and tooling that is multi-cluster aware, multi-cluster enabled by default, I think the convergence of that will make it simpler to manage clusters. And then the next thing there is the naming of this is still kind of settling in the industry, but Kubernetes resource management. So another way of thinking of this is infrastructure through the Kubernetes API. In 2023 and 2024, we saw cross-plane be one of the main ways people were doing this. But over 2024, we saw the maturity of things like AWS controllers for Kubernetes. And then we also saw KRO, Kubernetes Resource Orchestrator, released by AWS, and there's others as well. This is the idea of using the Kubernetes API to manage resources outside of Kubernetes, right? Not just like your pods or controllers, but to have controllers that, for example, spin up another EKS cluster, spin up an S3 bucket, manage a database, manage other infrastructure. And this pattern, we saw advanced customers start to use this back all the way in 2022, 2023. 2024 was massive amounts of maturity in this space, a lot of different options, and this pattern being adopted by more and more. And back to what you were saying about this, what you're selecting, is this, your bespoke little cluster, or is this like a main cluster that you will deploy clusters from? The convergence of the stack reference architectures, the convergence of tooling being multi-cluster aware, multi-cluster enabled, and the convergence with these things like KRO, ACK, cross-plane enable this fleet management now. And then bolting and then standardizing on GitOps, right? To be the main thing that manages the CI/CD of all of this, at least the CD part. That's definitely going to be front and center in 2025. That's going to be probably one of the main patterns that people talk about. And if you're just learning this stuff, think about beyond just one cluster. Think about how you would do this across multiple clusters, whatever you're learning. So I have a bunch of other predictions and projections for next year, but I'll do it real quick. So optimizing inference through Kubernetes, I think we just talked about that. Things like KEDA, things like the continued performance enhancement of using the compute, that the GPU compute, the different accelerated architectures. Inference as a use case is going to grow.
We should define inference, by the way. It's not a standard term yet. So
no worries. So there's in general, and this is like very high level, there's two parts of machine learning. One part is the training. So that's the creation of a machine learning model. Think with respect to Gen AI, think large language model training. This is what like OpenAI, Anthropic, the big tech companies, that's what they're doing, right? Meta, they're training on Kubernetes to make these large language models. The other side, like when we use Claude or when we're using Bedrock or when we're using Copilot or whatnot, we're doing inference. So we're using that model with new data and getting output from that model. That model exists and it's trained already. And so that's inference. Inference is, you're not typically doing model training all the time. Inference is the majority of the machine learning compute workload, right? But it's very cost sensitive, right? Like we mentioned, the compute, you still need GPUs to do inference, or you need accelerated compute to do it efficiently. And so getting the best performance value, sustainable value out of your compute is around optimizing these inference workloads. And everyone's trying to figure out how to do this better and better every day. There's a lot of money, a lot of energy around that. And most of these folks are using Kubernetes as the place to do inference. Edge hybrid, we mentioned hybrid with KubeVirt and EKS hybrid nodes. I think as we're tackling this larger swath of late adopters in the IT industry, the hybrid use case is going to be front and center in 2025. That's just a natural part of the conversations we're having and the new people that are coming into this community. GitOps maturity, we just mentioned with respect to multi-cluster, Argo maturity. And then BottleRocket Flatcar. Flatcar became a CNCF project. BottleRocket is a AWS similar operating system. These are Linux distros that are specifically designed for containers. I know me and you, Bret, have been talking about container optimized Linux distributions for a long time, right? There's a lot of exploration of this space back in the 2015, 2016 timeframe. That hasn't stopped. And I think we're seeing the reason that adoption might have been tricky in the past and some challenges is that traditional IT shops, oftentimes your system administration teams, central IT teams, your your security teams, your CISO, they have specific tooling that's oriented toward what I will call traditional Linux operating systems. Think RHEL, think Ubuntu, think AWS Linux, Amazon Linux. And these distributions are optimized for containers. They're hardened. They've removed a lot of the surface area. You don't need cups, the cups package, for example, on these Linux distributions. And they're the minimum you need to just run containers. And they're awesome. I highly encourage folks, if you're new, to look into these operating systems. My prediction for 2025 will be that we will see more and more adoption of these type of operating systems. And we will see the security tooling, observability tooling adapt to being able to run as containers in these type of locked down, hardened operating systems. And that's another prediction for 2025. Keep an eye on this space. The fact that Flatcar was brought into the CNCF is an indication that there's still a lot of activity in this space. Yeah, so those are my predictions for 2025. We'll see. Maybe we can bring up this list next December and see how far on or off base we were.
To see if we keep score.
Yeah, it's always risky, but that's okay.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's funny because Flatcar, I'm like, well, how is this different than CoreOS and all these various attempts? Rocket, whatever. Yeah. Rocket was the runtime. And the only thing I can think of, and I don't actually know if this is right, but the only thing I think of is that I don't know of a company that is betting their revenue model on this OS being successful. As far as I know, this is there are companies behind it, but it is a group and everyone's motivated a little bit because they also would like something a little simpler to maintain and easier to deploy. And there's not an alliance with a particular vendor because it's their product that we don't have to. I don't know any of this by fact. I just know with seeing talks about it, listening to the pitches. I watched that. There was actually a talk on it at Rejects at KubeCon, and I'm all in for this. I just hope this one lasts, right? Because I think I feel like multiple times now we've been like, oh, Linux for containers, this is a thing. And then we find out, oh, it's now end of life and I have to move back to Ubuntu, which is fine. Ubuntu's great.
And I see a lot of community interest and there's activity and action and updates and exploration in this space. Not making any comments about what it was like 10 years ago when these first Linux operating systems for containers came out. But I think as folks mature their usage, the same thing, conversation around ChainGuard and hardened base images, for example, it's in that same vein. We're trying to get to better, easier, simplified, production-ready, hardened, secure Kubernetes clusters, and BottleRocket, Flatcar, these Linux distros for containers that are hardened, that have removed a lot of that surface area, are a piece to that story. And that's why I think there's going to be growth in this area for sure as those late adopters start adopting Kubernetes. And the last thing is just simplification. I think we're already seeing that in 2024. We're going to continue to see that. More turnkey-like platforms built on top of Kubernetes and opinionated stacks. I think 2025 is going to be the Kubernetes stack year. How about we say that? That's our hot take. Lamp for Cades.
I can get into that. Yeah, we were talking before the show. I'd love to focus on some time on building out some of these architecture patterns that we're seeing and providing examples of maybe how to implement the advice that others are giving, because putting things in words and making screenshots for Markdown, great. It's a great start. Now we need people to actually try to implement it and have watching not just I implement this tool, but also this is how I'm using all these tools together to get the job done. And we start talking about higher level ideas of I need to deploy functions. I need to deploy a line of business app that has a 1 terabyte container image. I don't know. Things that people ask, but there's no one tool that says it'll do that for them. So then they're like, okay, there's 30 tools in this graduated list. Which of these tools do I need to do that?
Yep.
Anyway, it'll be fun to see this stuff come together in a way that's doesn't require 200 hours of education video education in order to get you through all of them, right? Because I've got a 21-hour course that's about to be more hours of courses. And it's just really talking about Docker and Kubernetes and a few extra tools. It doesn't go into any of this other stuff. And we can't expect people to take a 150-hour worth of video courses in order to just deploy workloads in containers. So real quick, I'll do two things, and then I know we're gonna run. Actually, maybe three. The first one is, I just want to get this one out of the way because it's a short one, and it's not anything we've been talking about, but it's open source licensing.
Yes. There was a lot of discussion this year about that.
Yeah, that we've seen over the last couple of years as very successful open source projects realize that their model, like the revenue model of open source projects, still has not been perfected as in other words, if your project is successful, it doesn't necessarily correlate with whether your business and company that made that open source will be successful. And we're still 30 years into open source, still actually 35 years since the SFS was created. We're still trying to figure out that model, right? We know of a rancher's model, like these typical models in Ubuntu and other ones where you pay for support. We have the Red Hat model where if you get this open source basic stuff, but if you want to use our real version, you have to pay for it on a subscription plan. And then we have all these other weird models in between. So a talk, CNCF, put out 3 weeks ago, basically around the time of KubeCon. It was at KubeCon. It was a day at KubeCon called Startup Fest, and all the players were there. And having had a failed tech startup in my past that I co-founded, it was a real thing. We were taking customer money. We just didn't make enough of it to pay for ourselves. And then having had 6 businesses in my life that my wife have started, I'm lover of open source since the 90s. Used it in my daily work since the early 2000s, if not the 90s. And having worked in this community for so long, I really strongly identify with this talk around the right way isn't necessarily let's open source everything and then create a business on top of it later. Like he goes through, this is Adam, who's now the creator of System Initiative, but he also created Chef. You may have heard of that. And Adam is really good at sort of being a lover of, like he calls himself a hippie, open source hippie, but also understanding that you can't pay for open source with well wishes and free coffees. You have to pay for it with real money. And in order to make open source software successful, you need to make billions. And some people need to make billions. And in order to do that, so he compares models, he shows different companies and like the profit of Microsoft Office versus the profit of Ubuntu versus the profit of Red Hat and the different licensing models that affect all this. And it's a wonderful talk. I think everyone who's ever thought about starting an open source project that they might someday want to charge for, watch this talk. I think is like the most succinct way to do it. Anyway, moving on to the next one. You talked about like the LAMP stack, and I'm not going to go any more into that, but the idea that we can get to a stack that we all just, when I say I'm running the Kubernetes blah stack, like even that fact that we could have a word there, and that implies that I'm using Argo, that I'm using Loki plus Prometheus plus Cert Manager plus Falco and Jaeger. And I have this stack that's like the basic needs of every cluster that I know. And it's not a vendor stack. It's not like I run Rancher or I run OpenShift because that's been what's been filling the gap. The gaps have been filled by distributions. Okay, that's fine. That's great. If you want to go distribution, I love it. Like I've been advising people to do that for a long time. But can we get to a couple of sane, purely open source stacks like LAMP? I'm hoping for 2025. The last thing I will say is reading the tea leaves. And this is the one I wanted to spend 1 minute on. Reading the tea leaves. I talked about this in a YouTube short I actually made. So if you want to figure out where open source for cloud native is going, to me, you look at the projects. What are the new sandbox projects? What are the projects that are considering or trying to go to incubating or graduated? What are the projects that have existed that are now saying, hey, we want to be a part of CNCF too? Like, to me, that is, if it's all open source, like we're reading the tea leaves of the open source, this is like probably one of the most important repos for predicting that, because it's simply a list. This is the official way you get into the CNCF. And you go through this process, and it starts with a GitHub issue. And we can see ones in here that, like, you'll notice there's a trend lately of like all these runtime related things. And then you can see once they get accepted, they go into onboarding their projects into the sandbox. They don't always go into sandbox depending on their maturity. They might go into incubation, which a few recently have done straight to incubation. Flat car going straight into incubation, not even moving past sandbox on day one into the CNCF. And then you can see the team working to onboard it. And then you can see the teams that are wanting to promote.
Just look how many projects are there that we did not mention.
Right. This is just the last 3
Right.
months, man. This is dozens of new projects. Yoke. I'm just going to throw it in there for the audio audience. Kepimetheus. It's like Prometheus plus
KubeFleet. Oh, what's KubeFleet?
K-Sale, KitOps. Hyperlight was the thing that I talked about at KubeCon that I couldn't remember the name of from Microsoft, which is a micro VM barrier for all containers. They're talking about it for functions done by Ralph.
Look at KubeFleet. Like we were just talking about multi-cluster. And that's like another way of thinking about deployments across multiple clusters.
Also from Microsoft. Yeah, KubeFleet from Microsoft for managing multi-cluster fleets of Kubernetes. These are all projects getting started in the CNCF, right? And then if you scroll down this list, you see some that are like not even new. I think I saw one on here that was like Podman Desktop, Podman Container Tools. Like Podman now wants to be a part of the CNCF, 8 years in. Because they're not new, but they realize the value of being a part of this open source ecosystem and not just adjacent tooling, right? And they did announce some new things at KubeCon, I think, around Podman. There was something else in here real quick that I saw. It was something about storage. Like OpenTofu's trying to get in.
KHGPT. We mentioned this briefly in an earlier show, but keep an eye on things like KHGPT. We didn't talk about this as predictions and trends because there's a lot of people talking about Gen AI for 2025. Gen AI tooling, Gen AI features for operations of clusters, observability, security, definitely going to be a thing for 2025.
Anyway, the tea leaves are open source too. And so if you're going to read the future, the tea leaves, as they say, then I would say go check out the Sandbox and just read up on the process, how projects get into the CNCF, how they move from Sandbox to incubation. There's meetings, there's public. It's all in public. They try this so hard to make all of this governance not some black box that you only know about when they announce things on the blog, right? Yeah.
We've gone through a lot of surface area today, a lot of things.
Was that enough? I feel like that's the most we've ever done. That was a lot.
I think we covered almost all the major things that we for sure saw. Some of the stuff that there's some definite 2025 predictions that I'll be very interested to see come to fruition and see if I'm right in next December. Bret, bring up this page, December, put it in your calendar, December 2025, bring up this.
Okay, I'll copy this note over for historical perspective. What maybe next year we do is we level up and we, not to be snarky, but we predict one thing's demise. Like one project that won't be a thing or will be archived or less. I didn't even talk about what everyone should go also look at is, in addition to the excellent surveys done by Stack Overflow, the CNCF also does their own surveys. And I don't think that the 2024 one, I'm not sure if it's out yet.
Usually they come in the beginning of the next year.
And we have DORA ones. We have DORA surveys that are great. But the CNCF ones are also great if you're into this ecosystem, because you start to, and they point out trends and differences between this year and last year. And like, there was something on this list, like, look at the growth of these projects, right? This is another tea leaves moment of, this is the growth in a year of people using these products. So Prometheus, 24%, not super surprising. No. Helm, 25% growth in usage.
We talked about Prometheus and OpenTelemetry in the 2023 end of the year show and KubeCon. Like, those are the main projects. So it'll be interesting to, maybe we can pull this up early next year and see what the difference between 2023 and 2024 was. But I mean, some of these are pretty straightforward trends.
you and I talked about at KubeCon, Argo, which has gone from 54 to 67%.
That was a year ago.
Yeah, that was last year. It's up to 67%. Envoy, I talked about that Envoy was probably the winner in the proxy wars, it felt like, to 54% in 1 year. And this is across all respondents saying they're either evaluating it for production use or using it in production as opposed to the year before. So things like Containerd and Core DNS and Helm and just CNI and etcd, I feel like those are just all fall under Kubernetes. Like if you're using Kubernetes.
Yeah, like we could probably just safely put those to the side.
But Prometheus, I mean, look at that, 62 to 77% in 1 year. That's a big jump in respondents.
All right. I think Bret and I have a pretty good idea of what topics we want to cover in 2025, but we're always interested in seeing what's out there. Maybe we missed something, but we want to make sure that you get value out of this. And hopefully we gave you a little bit of a roadmap on what to explore and what to kick the tires on and what to look at for your environments, your education, what to go deep on for 2025. And I know I've got a reading list of my own, so I can't wait to dig into that with you, Bret, next year.
A lot of reading, a lot of video watching. And
one last shout out. Bret, thank you for having me as a co-host. I think we completed 1 year almost of me being an official co-host. I know I've been on the show forever here and there, but thank you.
I agree completely with the idea that you are a great co-host and we match well. We almost match too much with our matching shirts, glasses, beards, and hair. I think this is, as long as this is still fun and we're hanging out, being friends on the internet, this is the best. So I'm so glad you said yes, being on the show, and that you didn't run for the hills after like 3 months of it, because it is work and the pay is crap.
Work when we're having fun, my friend.
It's not work when we're having fun. I thank you so much for being here and volunteering your time, and we will see you in the new year.
Happy New Year.
See you all soon. Thanks, Nirmal. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.